The knock on the door came sharp, too sharp for a Saturday morning. I wasn't expecting company. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the kitchen. Sarah was in the living room wrapped in a blanket, and the kids were upstairs sleeping in. It should have been a peaceful morning, but the moment I opened the door, peace ended. Two men stood there stiff-backed, eyes wide like they'd practiced looking intimidating in the bathroom mirror. They wore uniforms that sagged at the seams, polyester so cheap it squeaked when they shifted. The taller one lifted a plastic badge, one that glinted dully under the morning sun, and announced in a voice trying too hard to be official, "Sir, you're under arrest for community violations." For a moment, I thought this had to be a prank, maybe some neighborhood kids playing a joke, but these weren't kids, these were grown men, and the badges weren't even good fakes, Fisher-Price quality, the kind of thing you'd find in the clearance aisle at a Halloween store. Their belts had fake leather holsters, radios that didn't even light up, and shoes that squeaked with every nervous shift of weight. I leaned against the doorframe and let the silence stretch. My cop instincts were already working. Note the height difference. Note the twitch in the shorter one's hand, the way the taller one avoided eye contact. My training screamed one word: impostors. Still, I kept my face blank, calm, unreadable. "You're under arrest." I repeated slowly, like I hadn't heard right. "That's correct," the tall one said, his voice quivering slightly. "By order of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, you violated multiple community standards. We are authorized to detain you." Inside, Sarah's voice drifted from the couch. "Marcus, who's at the door?" I didn't answer. Not yet. My eyes stayed locked on the clowns standing in front of me. Authorized to detain me by an HOA. That's when it clicked. Brenda Thornfield. Of course, I let a beat pass before I spoke, low and steady. "And which department did you say you're with?" The shorter one glanced nervously at his partner, then blurted, "Municipal authority granted through the association." My jaw almost dropped. Municipal authority, HOA police. These two had no idea the storm they'd just walked into, because what they didn't know was that the man standing in the doorway when they were trying to arrest for a mailbox violation wasn't just another tired homeowner. I was Marcus Steele, chief of police, and I'd been wearing a real badge for over 20 years. I could have ended it right there, flashed my badge, called them out, dragged them in for impersonating officers. But some part of me, that quiet part that had been simmering ever since we moved into this HOA nightmare, told me to wait, to let this play out. Because Brenda thought she was running this show, and I wanted her to see how wrong she was. It's funny how 6 months can feel like 6 years when you're living under someone else's rules. 6 months ago, Sarah and I packed up everything we owned and left behind the only town we'd ever called home. Not because we wanted to, because we had no choice. Sarah's diagnosis came on a rainy Thursday in April. Stage 3 breast cancer. I can still hear the doctor's words, clinical and detached, echoing in that cold exam room. The treatment she needed advanced, aggressive, and with a fighting chance wasn't available in our rural town. We had two options: stay and watch her fade, or uproot our lives and move to a city with the care she deserved. There was no decision to make. I requested a transfer. Law enforcement doesn't pause for personal tragedy, but sometimes it bends. Within weeks I was sworn in at Willowbrook as their new police chief. New town, new badge, same oath, protect and serve. The house we bought wasn't perfect, but it was ours, a modest 2-story colonial with a big backyard and a kitchen Sarah immediately claimed as her sanctuary. The kids grumbled, of course. Emma, 16, cried about leaving her friends. Jake, 14, rolled his eyes and muttered about starting over. But they adjusted, slowly, leaning on each other the way siblings do when the ground beneath them shifts too fast. For the first few weeks, Willowbrook felt like the dream we'd needed. Quiet streets, neighbors who waved politely, kids riding bikes on sidewalks. It wasn't until the white Lexus appeared in our driveway, gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, that the cracks started showing. Brenda Thornfield introduced herself with a handshake so stiff it felt like a test. Clipboard tucked against her side like an extension of her arm. Her smile was wide, perfect, and as fake as the cubic zirconia jewelry she wore to make it look like real diamonds. She was the HOA president, she informed us proudly. 6 years running. "I keep Willowbrook in order," she said, scanning our house like a general inspecting troops. "Standards are what separate us from chaos." At the time, I brushed it off. I'd dealt with worse personalities in law enforcement. But within a week, the first violation arrived. Our mailbox apparently was not the approved shade of black. The letter was typed on thick cream-colored paper, embossed in gold, like it was announcing a royal wedding. I read it twice, then tossed it on the counter with a laugh. "She can't be serious," Sarah said, smiling faintly from the couch. Her scarf was tied neatly over her head, hiding the hair chemo had taken. A mailbox color, but Brenda was serious. The second letter came a week later. Our lawn had been improperly edged, never mind the fact that our landscaper had trimmed it to perfection just days before. According to Brenda, the clippings were too wide, 1 inch instead of ½ an inch. That was when I knew. This wasn't about mailboxes or lawns. This was about control. I've spent 2 decades dealing with bullies. Some wear gang colors, some wear business suits. Brenda wore pearls and carried a clipboard, but the tactics were the same. Pick targets, apply pressure, escalate until they cave. What she didn't realize was that she'd chosen the wrong family. I started documenting everything. Every notice, every letter, every smirk when she passed our house. I filed them neatly, like evidence in an ongoing case, because I knew where this was heading. And sure enough, the escalation came. One Saturday morning, I walked out to find our mailbox sprayed with orange paint. Same mailbox she'd claimed wasn't the right shade of black. Sarah gasped when she saw it, clutching her scarf tighter around her head. Emma snapped a photo for TikTok, muttering, "This place is insane." Jake just kicked the curb and said, "She's not gonna stop, is she?" That night, I installed cameras. Real cameras. Not the little doorbell kind, police-grade high-resolution infrared. Brenda saw them within hours. By evening, another letter appeared. "Your surveillance equipment is unsightly and must be removed." Immediately I called her. My voice was steady, the same voice I'd used countless times with suspects teetering on the edge of confession. "Mrs. Thornfield, these cameras protect my family. They're not coming down." Her reply was ice. "We'll see about that, Mr. Steele." And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a petty neighbor. This was war. The next morning, a certified letter showed up like a bad omen, pretending to be official. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind of paper that tries to talk down to you before you even open it. Inside, the words were colder than the air that seeped through the front door when I cracked it. A formal complaint had been filed with the city. It said, claiming I'd installed unlicensed surveillance equipment in violation of Municipal Code 14.73, fines of $500 per day would begin immediately if I didn't comply. The letter smelled faintly of perfume and printer toner. I could picture Brenda leaning over the machine, smiling to herself while it spit out official-looking threats like confetti. I carried the letter into the kitchen. Sarah was stirring honey into her tea, the steam fogging her glasses a little. She glanced up, reading my face first, then the letter when I slid it across the counter. Her lips pressed into a thin line that was half worry, half exhaustion. "We'd had enough papers tell us where our life was going for 1 year. Do we fight this?" she asked. Not because she didn't already know, but because it felt like we should say it out loud before we crossed another line together. "We don't roll over for bullies," I said. The taste in my mouth was metallic and familiar, like the moment before a door breach when the world narrows to a single clean action. I sat at the dining table with my laptop and the stack of violations that would warm under my forearms. The house quiet except for the soft rattle of a spoon in a mug and the whisper of pages as I organized them. Law is just a language. I've spent my life learning how to read it in voices, in rooms, in the shiver someone can't hide when the truth brushes past their ribs. Municipal Code 14.73. The number looked important, authoritative. It also didn't exist. I confirmed it twice. There was a section 14.7, but it ended at subsection 2, no 3. Brenda had invented a law that sounded real and hoped fear would do the rest. I took a breath that tasted like victory and coffee and printed the page anyway, highlighting the empty space where her fantasy should have been. That should have been the end. The problem with should is that it doesn't factor people like Brenda who don't know how to turn around even with a cliff ahead. I kept digging, past the municipal codes and into the brittle weeds where HOAs hide their roots. The state corporate registry lived behind a public web portal that hadn't been updated since the late 90s, but it still told truths if you knew how to coax them out. Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Inc. Status, delinquent. Annual report overdue 18 months. Sarah came beside me and leaned down, the fabric of her scarf brushing my cheek as she steadied herself with one hand on the chair back. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, feeling the quiet thrill that rides the spine when a puzzle finally clicks. "They don't legally exist right now. She can write as many letters as she wants, but she doesn't have a government behind her pen. Some men would print the page and march it straight to Brenda's door like a trophy. I called the city clerk instead and asked to be placed on the next council agenda. I didn't want a private win. I wanted sunlight. The weeks slid by in a sequence of small taut moments. Emma started filming short clips about HOA absurdities, just hands and paper and a voiceover. No faces, and posted them where teenagers build empires in an afternoon. Jake, quieter than his sister but quicker with patterns, started tracking the times Brenda's Lexus passed our house. 3 loops in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, a slow coast after sunset like a shark along a pier. I wrote everything down. When you're dealing with a bully, details are a kind of armor. The night of the council meeting, the municipal building smelled like stale carpet, old coffee, and 1,000 small compromises. I walked in wearing jeans and a polo shirt, just another citizen with a folder tucked under his arm, while Brenda stood near the front with her power suit ironing light into hard angles and a briefcase polished to a mirror. Her smile skimmed across me, not quite touching my skin, and settled on the council members like confetti. She was in her element. So was I. They called us one after the other. Brenda went first. She stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who's been mistaken for essential enough times to believe it, cleared her throat, and began to perform. She said words like community standards and hostile atmosphere and children's safety as if she was invoking spirits. She painted me as a rogue homeowner with a vendetta against decency. If I closed my eyes, I could almost see the script, the places where she'd underlined for emphasis. When she finished, I didn't clap. I stood, walked to the podium, and set my folder down the way you might set down a piece of delicate machinery that will change the room when it starts. The papers inside were warm from the heat of my hands. "I'm here as a neighbor," I said, keeping my voice easy, even and also as a man who reads the laws that I used to threaten him. It took exactly 30 seconds. That was all the city attorney needed to read the highlighted passages that bracketed a lie like a broken fence around a fallow field. He looked up at Brenda with a tiredness that didn't show in his suit and said, "Mrs. Thornfield, there is no Municipal Code 14.73 additionally. Your association's corporate status is delinquent. You have no standing to enforce anything." Silence took the room by the shoulders. Brenda's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The color fled her face in a rush so fast I thought she might be sick. Somewhere in the back row a chair creaked, the sound sharp as a twig snapping in a quiet forest. She gathered her briefcase like a shield and retreated, heels ticking a staccato code down the aisle. It would have been enough for most, but Brenda wasn't most. The next morning, as if conjured by spite, a man in a wrinkled gray suit arrived on our porch smelling like cheap cologne and old onions. He introduced himself as a private investigator and flashed a badge made of laminated fancy. He asked Sarah whether I had ever falsely claimed to be a police officer, whether I had a history of misconduct, whether I'd ever been asked to resign quietly. His voice tried to sound professional but kept tripping over his own breath. Sarah's stillness is a kind of strength. She has a way of making a room small enough to hold just the truth. She tilted her head, let concern crease her forehead in exactly the right measure, and said, "Oh Mike, do you have documentation of these allegations?" Her phone, unnoticed by the man who noticed nothing, recorded every word he left with nothing but his smell and the faint embarrassment he was too dull to recognize. I ran his name through a few old contacts over a beer. That evening, the bottle sweating rings onto a legal pad covered in times and roots. He'd been fired from the county sheriff's office years ago for falsifying reports. Brenda had hired a liar to invent me from rumor. I didn't wait for the next move. I made 2 calls, the first to my captain, letting him know that my name was about to be in rooms it didn't deserve for reasons it didn't earn. The second to internal affairs at the state level. I sent my entire personnel file without being asked. A confession of everything I'd done and everything I hadn't. By Sunday afternoon, I had letters on department letterhead that said, in so many words, that I was who I said I was, and that the man trying to unmake me was a story that didn't sell. You would think an embarrassment in public and a clean bill of integrity would give a person pause. Brenda responded like a cornered, an animal that smells its own fear and decides to bite the world. The letters multiplied. The Lexus lingered. Neighbors whispered to me at the mailbox about notices for paint shades, infinitesimally off from a palette no one had ever seen. About fines for toys left visible at 3:07 p.m. About aggression wrapped in stationery thick enough to bruise. In between all of it, there were evenings that held us together. Emma at the table editing a video about HOA logic that made Sarah laugh so hard she had to set her tea down. Jake at the sink, rinsing dishes with a concentration usually reserved for perfecting a jump shot, asking casually if I thought it was illegal to cite someone twice for the same grass clippings. Sarah's hand finding mine while we watched a silly show we'd seen a dozen times just because it was easy. Life didn't stop for Brenda, I just learned to walk around her. I didn't want the neighborhood to merely survive her, I wanted it to breathe again. I started walking in the evenings, not in a patrol way, but in a neighbor way. People talk when they trust their own porches. On Maple, Mr. Peterson limped out with a mug that had seen several generations of coffee and told me how the letters kept him up at night. On Birch, the Garcias showed me a violation for a flower pot color that didn't exist in the Bible. At the corner of Ivy and 5th, the Johnsons leaned on their truck and told me about 3 fines in a week while they worked doubles to keep childcare afloat. I wrote it all down, not as a cop, as a witness. The pattern was there for anyone who wanted to see it. The people targeted first were the ones who had the least time to fight. The mechanic who couldn't take off work to attend a meeting. The teacher who graded papers until midnight and didn't have the energy left to argue about terracotta. The veteran who knew every inch of this nation's rules except for the silly ones that mattered where he slept. Bullies pick people who won't punch back quickly. Brenda had miscalculated the neighborhood's appetite for solidarity. When the petition arrived, it came in a manila envelope slipped under my door like a threat that wasn't brave enough to knock. 12 signatures, most in the same slanted hand, pretending to be 12 different people, demanding that I cease my intimidation tactics. I took photos, checked names against property records, called 3 people who moved away years ago, and felt a cold, clean certainty settle into my bones. Brenda wasn't just petty. She was criminal, and criminal is a language I speak. The day I saw the orange spray paint on our mailbox, a color so vivid it hurt, the kind that marks football fields and pipelines, the kind that says, "This is mine," even when it isn't, I stood very still. The camera over the porch caught the wind moving the thin plastic flag on the side like a heartbeat. I went inside and loaded the footage. A narrow shoulder, a spray can lifted like a pistol, a Lexus, reflection passing in the glossy window of a parked car across the street. Sarah came to stand behind me and put a hand on my shoulder, her palm warm, her breath steady. "Enough," she said, one word, and all the other words that had been waiting seemed to line up behind it. I upgraded our surveillance, not just more cameras, better angles, redundancy, hidden mics that captured the sound of gravel under tires, the specific click of a cheap heel on poured concrete. I ran tests until midnight, made notes, mapped a grid of sightlines for the whole street. I called a buddy at the bureau to ask an innocent question about impersonation statutes and hung up with a list of things to read before bed. 2 days later, a teenager from down the block mentioned uniforms he'd seen in the trunk of a beat-up Civic that didn't belong to anyone on our street. He said the badges looked weird. He said the fabric squeaked. My heart did something hard and old in my chest. Brenda wasn't satisfied with letters and rumors and vandalism. She wanted theater. She wanted sirens, even if she had to draw them with crayons. The knock I'd been waiting for came from a boy who barely needed to shave. He had arms like young trees and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. He called me sir twice before he'd finished his first sentence and confessed that his aunt wanted him to do something that didn't sound legal. She'd paid half up front. She'd said they only had to look tough. She'd said she had authority if anyone asked. He asked, in the small voice of someone who didn't expect mercy but hoped for it anyway. Whether I thought pretending to be a cop could really send a person to prison. "It can," I said, "and it does." He swallowed hard enough for his throat to click. He told me Saturday. He told me start at Mr. Peterson's house. He told me the rest in bits and chunks, as if every fact had to fight through a thicket of fear before it reached the air when he left. I stood in the kitchen with my hands flat on the counter and let the quiet of our house settle over me like armor. Then I started making calls. The FBI first, because if Brenda wanted a stage, I was going to make sure the right audience filled the seats. Then the district attorney, who understood a good story when he saw one sting operations play well if they end with handcuffs and a press release. Then a favor with the local paper, not to sensationalize, but to watch, to record, to make sure the truth had eyes other than mine. By Friday afternoon, the garage had been transformed. Charts lined the pegboard where my wrenches used to hang. A whiteboard held a timeline written in a hand that wasn't quite mine anymore, all edges and precision. The air smelled like dry erase marker and motor oil and Sarah's coffee. When Agent Rodriguez walked in, she set a briefcase on the workbench and opened it to reveal a stack of forms that could put a person in prison for lying to the wrong line. "Here's how we do this without dropping a stitch," she said, tapping the relevant statutes with a nail trimmed short. "We let her people commit the act, cameras, angles, audio. Then we move clean, no intimidation, no chaos. We arrest her on what she does, not who she thinks she is." Neighbors came by in ones and twos, then in clusters. Mr. Peterson stood straighter than I'd seen him in months and volunteered to be first, because some men never retire from courage. Mrs. Patricia arrived with a spiral notebook of HOA accounting that looked like it had survived a flood and a fire, and Sarah greeted her like a general receiving intelligence from the front lines. The Garcias brought a network of group texts and a calm that made everything feel less like a movie and more like a plan. I briefed them in the backyard under a sky that held the first crisp suggestion of fall. I told them where to stand, how to film, when to speak, and when to let silence do the work. I told them what to expect when fear tries to bluff with volume. I told them that this wasn't vengeance. It was the opposite. It was a neighborhood reminding itself what it looks like when people refuse to be ruled by someone else's insecurity. When the sun went down, the air cooled and the lights in our kitchen warmed the windows. Sarah leaned over the whiteboard with a highlighter and connected the last loose ends of our timing. Emma tugged my sleeve and asked if there was a way to stream 2 angles at once without losing quality. Jake, looking more like a man than a boy in the slant of the garage light, asked if he could be the one to monitor the radio on the FBI channel, not to speak, just to listen, to learn the cadence of real authority. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, her voice low, steady. "Tomorrow we breathe again." I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, to the small sounds that mean a home is still a home, the distant hum of the fridge, the whisper of a branch against the siding, the brief, soft cough of one of the kids turning over. My badge rested on the dresser where I always set it, heavy in the way symbols are heavy. I thought about every door I'd opened into rooms like this one, about every time fear had leaned in, and we had pushed it back with nothing but our hands and our stubborn insistence that people deserve to feel safe where they sleep. What Brenda didn't understand, what bullies never do, is that power isn't a badge or a letterhead or a Lexus. Power is neighbors who look at each other and decide they're done being shoved around. Power is a woman in a scarf who turns numbers into a story a jury can understand. Power is a veteran with a spine so straight it makes lies feel embarrassed. Power is a teenage girl with a phone who knows where to point it, and a teenage boy who has learned the difference between noise and signal. When the alarm went off before dawn, the house felt wound like a bowstring. I slid from bed, pressed a kiss to Sarah's forehead, and stood for a heartbeat at the window. The street lay quiet, a ribbon of gray between trimmed lawns that had all grown their own silent defiance. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then remembered it was early. I brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon at attention and took it to the garage. The screens flickered to life, one after the other, the neighborhood appearing in squares and rectangles like a quilt my mother might have sewn if she'd had cameras instead of fabric. I checked each feed, each angle, each little green dot that meant backup systems were humming in the background. Agent Rodriguez slid into a folding chair, with the ease of someone who's spent her life entering rooms that weren't hers and making them steady. She gave me a small nod, a professional courtesy that said we were colleagues today in the most important way. By 7, the neighborhood was awake. By 7:15, Brenda began her circuits in a white Lexus, pacing the block like a figure skater, practicing a routine. By 7:30, the first unmarked car settled at the corner where it could see without being seen. By 8, 3 dozen phones were fully charged and ready. By 8:10, Mr. Peterson had his front door open and his handshake ready for whatever came. By 8:15, the Civic with the crooked magnetic decals crept past the stop sign as if hesitation could make it invisible. I put my palm on the desk. The surface was cool. My pulse was not. "Let's go," I said. Though no one needed the words, the day was already coming toward us. Outside, the light broke clean over the rooftops, and the street looked like any other suburban morning, which it is exactly the kind of morning that breaks into something else and becomes a story people tell when they want to remember. How a neighborhood found its voice. Saturday morning began with the kind of air that feels too clean, too sharp, like the world is pretending to be calm before it decides to tear open. The sun hadn't even fully climbed yet when Sarah slid a plate of pancakes onto the table, her scarf tied neatly, her hands steady in a way that steadied me. The smell of maple syrup mixed with the faint scent of damped grass drifting through the window. I barely touched my food. My eyes kept flicking to the monitors set up in the garage, each one showing a different angle of the neighborhood. Emma sat with her phone propped up against a juice glass, already recording, already live. Her followers had been primed for this. The moment all week. "This is it," she whispered, her face half lit by the glow of the screen. "It's about to go viral." Jake sat beside her with a notepad, of all things, scribbling times, jotting down details like he was already writing the report. Even at 14, he had the same sharp focus I'd seen in seasoned officers about to walk into a raid. At exactly 7:30, the first sign of Brenda appeared, her white Lexus creeping through the neighborhood like a predator tracing its territory. She drove slow, pausing at corners, checking porches, her perfectly coiffed hair catching glints of light through the windshield, 3 loops for each one tighter, like she was circling prey she thought was too weak to fight back. By 8:10, my earpiece crackled. Agent Rodriguez's calm voice slid into the silence. "All units in position. Subjects are mobile." And then it happened. A beat-up Honda Civic rolled into Willowbrook Estates, a car so dented it looked like the road had already rejected it. Crooked magnetic decals clung to the door spools in bold black letters, the L clearly pasted upside down. The paint was peeling, the tires balding, but what made me exhale a slow, humorless laugh were the uniforms. 2 young men climbed out, polyester squeaking with every step. Their badges shone dull and cheap, and from one camera angle I could see the word spelled wrong. POLCE. Derek looked miserable. His buddy, jittery and pale, tried to puff up his chest, but the way he kept adjusting his belt made him look like a kid in a school play who'd forgotten his lines. They stood there for a second, like 2 amateurs psyching themselves up for a performance no one believed in, then walked toward their first target, Mr. Peterson's house. Peterson had volunteered for this. Vietnam had given him scars and medals, and Brenda's HOA had given him enough reasons to want payback. My cameras caught every angle as Derek knocked on his door, his hand trembling just slightly against the wood. Peterson opened it slowly, his face calm, his posture steady as if he was greeting unwelcome solicitors rather than fake law enforcement. "Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest," Derek announced, his voice cracking on the word warrant. Peterson didn't blink. "Badge number?" he asked flatly, his gravelly voice carrying across the lawn. The fake officer froze. He glanced at his partner, who pretended to study his plastic badge like he was discovering it for the first time. "We don't need to give you that," Derek stammered. Peterson smiled faintly, then pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up with deliberate calm. "Then I think I'll call the real police." I nearly spit out my coffee watching from the monitor. The crowd, small at first, began to gather. Neighbors leaned on fences, kids peeked from behind their parents, phones lifted one after another. The sting had begun. The second house was the Garcias. Maria Garcia, an elementary school teacher with the kind of patience that could make grown men sweat, answered the door with her phone already recording. Her voice was cool, professional. Officers, could I see your credentials? The shorter man puffed his chest. Ma'am, you're in violation of community standards. You need to comply. Which law specifically? She asked. The question hit them like a sledgehammer. They shifted uncomfortably, polyester groaning. That the HOA law, Derek muttered. A ripple of laughter broke from the watching crowd. HOA law. Phones caught every word. Emma's live stream counter ticked up with hundreds, then thousands of viewers. Comments flashed. This is insane. Fake cops. What HOA is this? By the time the impostors reached the Johnsons' driveway, the neighborhood had transformed. Veterans pointed out flaws in the uniform's wrong stitching, plastic buttons. Parents whispered explanations to their kids, teaching them the difference between authority and a costume. Teenagers held phones high like war correspondents broadcasting a frontline battle. The tension wasn't fear anymore, it was theater. That's when Brenda made her move. Her Lexus pulled to the curb and she stepped out like a general marching into a battlefield. Power suit flawless, clipboard clutched like a shield, heels clicking with each determined step. Her voice cut across the chatter, sharp and shrill. What seems to be the problem here? Jerry Martinez, another veteran, called from the crowd. Lady, your fake cops can't answer basic questions. Brenda didn't flinch. These are legitimate law enforcement officers operating under HOA authority, she declared, conviction dripping from every syllable. The laughter that followed was like a wave. Phones trembled in hands, recording her delusion from every angle. I saw Rodriguez's camera feed zoom in, her voice cool in my ear. Let her talk, let her dig. Brenda turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the crowd like a queen facing disobedient subjects. Anyone who interferes with official police business will be arrested for obstruction. She pointed her clipboard like it was a weapon. Disperse immediately. No one moved. If anything, the crowd pressed closer. Mrs. Patricia, 80 years old, and wielding her smartphone like a sword, stepped forward. Real police always show ID, she said firmly, her voice trembling but strong. The polyester-clad impostors shifted again, sweat staining their collars. One of them tugged at his misspelled badge as if it might magically correct itself. Derek's eyes darted toward me on the monitor, a silent plea. He knew it was unraveling. And then Brenda made the mistake I had been waiting for. She marched up my walkway, her heels ticking like a countdown. The cameras caught every step, every flick of her hair, every righteous flare of her nostrils. She stopped at my porch, flanked by Derek and his partner, and announced loud enough for the entire block to hear, Mr. Steele, you are under arrest for failure to comply with lawful HOA directives. The neighborhood went still. 50 phones pointed at her. Rodriguez whispered in my ear. She just crossed it. We've got her. Through the intercom, I let my voice roll slow and calm. Ma'am, what specific law enforcement agency are you representing? She straightened her shoulders, chin lifting. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, operating under municipal authority. That broke it. The crowd erupted in scattered laughter, disbelief, outrage. Tom Brady, the local newspaper editor, called out, HOAs don't have police powers, ma'am. I checked. Brenda flushed deep crimson, her eyes wide, her mouth trembling, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She stepped forward, onto my porch, and jabbed the clipboard toward the doorbell camera. I am exercising police authority to place you under citizen's arrest for obstruction of justice. Phones flashed, kids screamed, neighbors gasped, and Rodriguez's voice came calm and steady in my ears. Stand by. She just buried herself. Inside, I adjusted my collar, the weight of my uniform pressing against my shoulders like a familiar, old friend. The moment was here. Years of law enforcement, months of harassment, weeks of planning all leading to this. I turned the doorknob, the cameras zoomed, the crowd hushed like a mute button had been pressed across the world, and I stepped onto the porch. The crowd froze when the door swung open. For a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath, the sound of birds gone, the distant hum of traffic swallowed into silence. 50 phones tilted upward, their glass eyes capturing every flicker of light, every twitch of muscle. Brenda's heels scraped once against the concrete, then stopped as I stepped into view. Full uniform, polished badge gleaming, the dark navy fabric fitting like a second skin, heavy with authority that wasn't borrowed or faked. My hat tucked under one arm, my shoulders squared in the posture I had carried into crime scenes, into courtrooms, into chaos. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. I know because I counted them later while replaying the footage. And then it cracked open like thunder. Cheers, gasps, laughter, the ragged explosion of a neighborhood's relief all at once. Phones jolted in hands as neighbors clapped, whistled, shouted. The sound was so loud even my camera shook. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on a dock. No, this is impossible, she stammered, clipboard quivering in her grip. You can't be. This is illegal. This is entrapment. I let the quiet weight of my voice cut through the chaos. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Chief Marcus Steele, Willowbrook Police Department, badge number 001, and you are under arrest for impersonating law enforcement officers. The words landed like a hammer. Derek's partner dropped his plastic badge instantly. He clattered against the porch with the hollow sound of cheap metal meeting reality. Derek himself raised his hands halfway, eyes darting between me and Brenda, like a kid caught sneaking out after curfew. Brenda's face cycled through shades of red, then white, then something pale and sickly. She jabbed her clipboard toward me, her voice screeching into a register that set teeth on edge. This is harassment. You're not the real police. You're pretending. This is all a trick. Before I could answer, a new voice rose from the crowd, sharp and steady. No trick, ma'am. Agent Maria Rodriguez stepped forward, her federal badge gleaming in the bright morning sun. The crowd hushed again, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI, and you've just committed several federal crimes on camera, including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and impersonation of federal officers. If silence had weight, it pressed down on Brenda. Then her knees trembled, her knuckles white on the clipboard. She spun in a frantic half-circle, eyes darting for escape, for allies, for anyone willing to believe her fantasy. None came. The neighborhood she had ruled through intimidation was now a gallery of witnesses. Every lens pointed at her downfall. This is entrapment, she shrieked, voice breaking. I'll call my lawyer. I'll call the real police. I stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, controlled, the porch groaning softly under my weight. Ma'am, I am the real police. And right now, you're making this worse for yourself. The crowd erupted again, this time with laughter that carried the bite of years of pent-up frustration. Someone shouted, "Show her the door, Chief." Another voice, younger, rang clear. Justice, at last. Phones tilted higher, capturing her every twitch. Emma's livestream viewer count ticked into the tens of thousands. The wail of sirens grew louder, threading through the chaos like a final act of punctuation. 3 marked police cruisers rolled into the neighborhood from different directions, lights bouncing off windows, reflecting in the wide eyes of kids who would never forget this day. Behind them, an unmarked federal SUV slid to the curb, followed by a news van with its antenna already rising toward the sky. Brenda turned, desperate, her eyes locking on the white Lexus like it was a lifeboat in a sinking ship. She stumbled toward it, heels catching in the cracks of the sidewalk. I'm leaving. You can't keep me here. This neighborhood is mine. Do you hear me? Mine. Rodriguez's handcuffs gleamed in the sun as she caught up easily, her stride measured. Inevitable, ma'am, she said firmly. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No, you can't. Brenda screamed, twisting, thrashing, clipboard falling to the pavement with a slap. The plastic corner cracked, fitting metaphor for the empire she'd built on paper and fear. 2 uniformed officers moved in from behind, flanking her with the quiet efficiency of men who'd done this dance countless times. She struggled, shrieking about conspiracies and entrapment, but her wrists were already bound, the silver cuffs clicking closed with a sound that made the crowd cheer louder than ever. Mrs. Patricia wept openly, phone shaking in her hand as she recorded the moment. Mr. Peterson, standing tall despite the limp that never left him, saluted me with crisp precision. Derek, pale and trembling, finally dropped to his knees on the sidewalk. His partner followed suit, polyester uniforms wrinkling as they raised their hands. We didn't mean she made us. The words tumbled out like a dam breaking. Officers moved in, collecting the fake badges, confiscating radios that still crackled with cheap static. Rodriguez turned to me with the faintest smile, tugging her mouth. Nicely done, Chief. Clean evidence. She wrote her own conviction. Tom Brady, the local newspaper editor, shouldered through the crowd with his photographer. Chief Steele, can we get a statement? The whole county's going to want this. On page 1. I glanced at Brenda being loaded into the back of the federal SUV, her designer heels scraping uselessly against the asphalt. The Lexus, once spotless, now looked pathetic as it was hooked to an impound truck, its polished white paint reflecting her downfall. Neighbors gathered closer, their faces bright with relief, with vindication. Tell them this, I said, my voice pitched to carry over the noise. Sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to let criminals hang themselves with their own rope. Brenda Thornfield chose the wrong neighborhood to run her scam. The crowd roared, a sound so loud, it felt like the street itself was exhaling after months of suffocation. Children laughed, teenagers hived, parents hugged. Emma's livestream comments scrolled too fast to read. A blur of legend and justice served and HOA nightmare destroyed. Sarah appeared at my side, slipping her hand into mine. Her eyes shone not just from the morning light, but from the quiet triumph of survival, the cancer treatments, the move, the harassment, all of it culminating here. It's over, she whispered, though we both knew it was just the beginning of something else. I looked around at my neighbors, the Johnsons, the Garcias, Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Patrician, felt the weight of the moment. For months they had lived in fear of letters and fines, of gossip and intimidation. Now they stood free, their voices louder than one woman's clipboard. Behind us, Brenda screamed one last defiant cry from the back of the SUV. This isn't over. You'll regret this. You'll all regret this. I squeezed Sarah's hand, my badge gleaming under the sun, and spoke softly enough that only she and the nearest phones caught it. "No, ma'am, this is justice." As the SUVs rolled away, the sound of cuffs clicking still echoing in the air, neighbors flooded into the street. Kids rode their bikes in wide circles, cheering like they'd won a championship. Parents pulled out grills. Someone started handing out sodas, and what had begun as a sting operation was already transforming into a block party. Emma turned her phone to me, breathless. "Dad, you've got over 100,000 people watching. This is insane." Jake grinned, the notepad still in his hands. Neighborhood's never gonna be the same. And he was right. The neighborhood would never be the same again. The neighborhood never forgot the sound of those handcuffs. For weeks, the echo of that metallic click seemed to linger in the air, a punctuation mark on every conversation, every shared smile, every quiet breath of relief. Brenda's Lexus didn't patrol the streets anymore. Her clipboard was gone. Her kingdom had fallen, and in its place something else had begun to grow. The FBI investigation moved quickly. Agent Rodriguez had more than enough evidence before Brenda even tried her little stunt with the fake cops. But the cameras, the live streams, the signatures, the financial records Sarah uncovered, they turned the case into a textbook example of HOA corruption on steroids. Within days, federal indictments were handed down. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, impersonation of federal officers. Charges stacked higher than the piles of paperwork Brenda had once used as weapons. Her trial drew media attention far beyond Willowbrook. News vans parked on the courthouse lawn. Cameras jostled for position. Anchors spoke breathlessly about the HOA queenpin, who thought she could invent her own police force. The footage of her shrieking on my porch, makeup streaked with sweat, heels scraping uselessly as agents cuffed her, looped on prime time. She became a meme, a cautionary tale, a national punchline. 3 days of testimony, 47 minutes of jury deliberation, guilty on all counts. The judge, a man with a gray beard and patience worn thin by decades of human folly, shook his head as he delivered the sentence. 12 years in federal prison, Mrs. Thornfield, he said, voice heavy with the weight of irony. "In all my years I've rarely seen a defendant work so diligently to incriminate herself." Her 2 officers turned state's evidence immediately, cutting deals that left them with probation and a lifetime reminder of how close they'd come to federal time. Derek found me afterward, eyes down, voice low. "Thank you," he muttered. I told him what I tell every young man who stumbles near a cliff: the difference between ruin and redemption is often just one good decision. But the real story wasn't in the courtroom. It was back home, where freedom finally felt like more than just a word. The $847,000 recovered from Brenda's fraud didn't vanish into government coffers. It came back to us, the families she'd bled dry with fake assessments and inflated bills. And with it, the neighborhood began to rebuild itself, not with fear and fines, but with ideas and laughter. The playground came first. The kids designed it themselves: slides, swings, climbing walls, even a mural painted in bright colors across the back fence. Every bolt tightened and every brush stroke layered felt like a declaration. This is ours. The sound of children's laughter rang through Willowbrook like a hymn, washing away the silence Brenda had imposed. Next came the senior center. Mrs. Patricia led Tai Chi classes in the mornings, her gentle instructions floating across the polished floor while sunlight streamed through windows Brenda once tried to keep shuttered. Mr. Peterson ran weekly military history sessions, his limp forgotten as teenagers listened with rapt attention, learning about duty, sacrifice, and what real service looks like. Sarah, stronger every day, was elected HOA treasurer in what could only be described as a coronation. No one ran against her. Why would they? She'd been the one who peeled back the layers of Brenda's fraud, who sat at our dining table with spreadsheets and sticky notes until the truth gleamed clear. Her slogan, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant," was painted across banners. At community events, Emma's live stream, which had captured the fake cops fumbling and Brenda's meltdown in real time, went viral far beyond anything she'd expected. News outlets used her footage, crediting her name in captions that flashed across millions of screens. Colleges noticed. She earned a full journalism scholarship and a summer internship with the FBI's white-collar crime unit. At 16, she'd already written herself into the story of Justice. Jake, quieter but just as determined, started a neighborhood safety patrol. Not with badges or bluster, but with kids, teaching kids how to tell the difference between real authority and the noise of bullies. His team of teenagers in neon vests patrolled the streets, waving at parents, helping seniors carry groceries, creating a sense of belonging Brenda had never understood. Property values soared, not because we excluded anyone, but because word to spread that Willowbrook wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community that had faced tyranny and chosen something better. Families wanted to live where laughter was louder than fines, where Saturday block parties were tradition, where the HOA didn't rule but served. The ripple effect stretched farther than our fences. Local news dubbed the new state legislation Brenda's Legacy, a package of reforms tightening oversight on HOAs, requiring financial transparency, and outlawing the kind of petty harassment she thrived on. Other neighborhoods called me, emailed me, begged for advice. Could I help them? Could I show them how to fight back? In 12 states, I walked families through their own wars, helping them recognize the warning signs, helping them document, organize, resist. The FBI even created a specialized HOA fraud task force, training new agents on our case. They invited me to speak at seminars using Brenda as Exhibit A in how greed dresses up as governance. I stood at podiums under fluorescent lights, telling rooms full of agents and attorneys and ordinary citizens what I'd told my neighbors that night in my backyard. Bullies only win if good people give up, but the truest victories weren't in task forces or laws. They were in the quiet moments. Sarah standing in our community garden, dirt under her nails, her laughter carrying across rows of tomatoes and roses. Emma scribbling notes at the kitchen table, earbuds in, eyes bright with ambition. Jake teaching a younger boy how to adjust the straps on a neon vest. Both of them grinning like they'd just cracked the code to adulthood. 6 months after Brenda's arrest, I stood in the very spot on my porch where she'd tried to declare herself queen of the block. The air smelled of fresh mulch from the community garden, of burgers grilling 3 houses down, of freedom. Neighbors waved as they walked by, not with suspicion, but with trust. Kids shouted in the distance, and I realized something simple and profound. Sometimes justice doesn't just restore what was lost. Sometimes it builds something better than you imagined. Brenda's name still floated around, whispered with disdain, occasionally used as a cautionary joke, but she was gone. 12 years in a federal cell, her empire of paper and fear dissolved into memory. The neighborhood no longer belonged to her. It belonged to us, and that's why I'm telling you this, because every neighborhood has a Brenda. Every community has someone who thinks fear is power, that silence is control, that people will always bow to clipboards and letters and empty threats. Maybe your Brenda hides behind bylaws. Maybe they wield rumors instead of fines. Maybe they think intimidation is a crown they can wear forever. But here's the truth. They only win if you let them. I want you to remember my story the next time you get a letter that smells more like arrogance than ink. Remember my story when you hear it. The knock of fake authority on your door. Remember that justice doesn't happen to other people. It happens when ordinary families decide enough is enough. Now it's your turn. Drop your HOA nightmare story in the comments. Share what you've lived through, because you are not alone. Your voice might be the one that helps another family realize they don't have to live in fear of paper tyrants. And if you want to see more stories of ordinary people taking down corrupt systems and winning, smash that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join us. Because every neighborhood has a Karen. And sooner or later, every Karen learns the same lesson Brenda did. Justice comes.